Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to Good Measure. My name is David and I'll be your host today. Today we have Tim Romero, head of Google for Startups and host of the Disrupting Japan podcast. He's here today with us to talk about innovation and change in Japan. Tim, thank you for being here with us. Do you mind quickly introducing yourself to those in the audience who may not be familiar with you and your work?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And thanks for inviting me. I'm the head of Google for Startups Japan. I run a podcast called Disrupting Japan. But I've been out in Japan for close to 30 years here. I've started 4 companies here, done a little bit of angel investing, some VC work, been deeply involved in the startup community here since before there was a startup community. A lot has changed since the dot-com days.
Yeah. And so speaking about that, as the host of Japan and someone who's really been involved in this industry, you must have witnessed so much trends that have gone on inside the Japanese startup industry. And so in the West, we have a lot of new tech focused on the blockchain, crypto. And has Japan followed suit, or where are their sort of startups focused?
Yeah, the crypto space is interesting. So there is a lot of interesting fintech in Japan, but the financial services agency is keeping a pretty tight leash on a lot of the crypto stuff, not on the technology side, but
Yeah.
they're pretty strict with the know your customer laws. They regulate the exchanges more tightly than a lot of other companies. So there are a lot of interesting crypto companies doing implementations. There's a company I know that's using blockchain to monitor like medical research to prevent information from being changed.
Yeah.
But we're not seeing the huge financial crypto NFT boom in Japan that we are in many other countries. And I don't think that's a bad thing, quite frankly.
And so speak on the growth end of things. Has there been a lot of growth in the way that Japanese startups innovate? I've personally heard that for a long time Japan has been playing catch up, and I was wondering if they've moved past that and are now innovating into new and important fields.
Well, I think it is fair to say Japan is still catching up, or Japanese startups are still catching up to the West. But I think the biggest change, the most important change, isn't necessarily the way individuals innovate, but it's been the emergence of a genuine ecosystem, a genuine startup ecosystem in Japan. So in the dot-com era, I mean, there were startups, there were founders, we were friendly, but there wasn't an ecosystem.
Yeah.
So for example, today we've got a lot of startups where their main customers are other startups. And this means like new ideas get adopted faster, iteration happens faster because startups are willing to take risks that big companies aren't. And then once things are proven in the startup ecosystem, then the larger companies can try it out, and companies can scale a lot faster. And that's something that's really only developed in the last 6 or 7 years in Japan.
And so, as someone who's sort of been in the sort of thick of it and on the sidelines and basically interviewing with all this podcast stuff, has working in your own Japanese startup helped you understand and sort of sympathize with these Japanese startups?
Yeah, definitely so. But I think it's more, I think it's more just knowing, having gone through the same thing, rather than any special practical advice or brilliant insights I have. I mean, there's a lot of smart people in this industry. But I mean, I like a buddy of mine, I was invested in his company, and he told me that the most valuable advice he got from me or from anyone at one point was just honestly telling him, like, all right, this fundraising round you're about to start is going to be really, really hard. And if it's hard, don't worry about it because you're still doing everything right, but it's going to be really rough. And he was like, you're right, that was incredibly hard, but he raised the funds. So yeah, I do think just having been through it gives me a lot of insight. But honestly, I think I've learned more from the guests on my show than they've learned from me. just talking with hundreds of startup founders, I mean, that's how you really expand your way of doing things, your way of understanding.
And so, speaking about interviewing all of these people, what are some of the most common qualities that you've noticed in these CEOs and founders?
I'd say, I mean, it's really hard to try to pin down like the one common quality, because there's so much difference from person to person. I think it would have been an easier question to answer 10 years ago, when it was really hard to start a startup and there was no support and you were really going against the grain. But now that it's become more supportive and friendly, I'd say that the most common, well, I'll tell you what, rather than trying to find one thing that's common in Japan, there's one thing I do find common among Japanese founders that is increasingly rare in the United States. So I think that Japanese founders have a genuine sense of mission, that they want to make the world a better place. And I think, I mean, I've been going back and forth to Silicon Valley for 25 years. And people still say that in Silicon Valley, but, and some people still mean it, but it's Japan today, the motivation of the founders, what they're trying, this world they're trying to build reminds me of Silicon Valley in the late 90s, more than Silicon Valley today.
And so, sort of speaking about their mission, I guess, what does success look like for most Japanese startups, and how does it sort of play out in a sense?
I think the success metrics are very similar among, at least among VC-funded startups in the US or in Japan. I mean, when you take VC money, you're signing up for a very particular business strategy, right? You're going for massive growth. You want to double every year or whatever your target is. So, the exit goals are the same. Among some of the bootstrapped companies, that's as different as the founders themselves. But for the VC funded ones, I'd say founders all over the world are pretty aligned on what they want on that.
And so I guess over like the last, I think it's 7 years of the Disrupting Japan podcast, what do you think have been like the most thought-provoking and interesting interviews, startups, or people that you've had on the show?
Oh, wow. I don't think, I mean, I can't pick a favorite. I mean, all of my episodes are my favorite. I have never released an episode that is not my favorite.
Are there like a few standout ones, I guess?
It's just, I've never been able to answer that question. I can tell you the ones that got the biggest response from the listener base, that they aren't always my favorites. So, actually the ones that have gotten the most response from the listeners have been the ones where I do a deep dive on the Japanese market. So I deconstructed Uber's Japanese market entry, what they did wrong, why it didn't work in Japan. I did an article on Tessay, the story behind the 7-minute miracle. The one with Naka Akiko of Wantedly did really well with listeners, but really it's listen to them all. They're all my favorite.
And I guess if it's hard to pin down this one, I think this might be a bit easier. But what have been some of the greatest lessons or things that you've learned? I guess if there's a common theme from interviewing these startups.
I think personally, the biggest lesson I learned, I can't say I learned it from this one person. It was kind of this something I began to realize. There are lots of different right ways of doing just about everything in the startup world. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's definitely wrong ways, but there a lot of things that I thought like, okay, this just won't work.
Yeah.
People have made work. And so I think I've just been I'm a lot more open-minded about what is possible and what is strategically viable than I used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, what I love doing, every once in a while, I'll get I'll hear a startup and the idea, and I'll go, it's not going to work. There's, XYZ is why it won't work. And it's like, well, they've got a couple thousand customers and they're growing. Like, really?
Yeah.
All right, let's get them on the show. They clearly know something I don't.
Yeah.
And actually, next Tuesday, I've got an episode coming out that's just like that. I heard the story and go, oh no, that's a dead end. They're going nowhere, and they're growing their customer base. Their customers love them, and like, all right, teach me what do you know that I don't? And it was a really good conversation.
Mm-hmm. I guess just to end on a sort of fun note, I guess, what are some of your favorite up and coming technologies that you think should be developed by a Japanese company or is being worked on behind the scenes that is not sort of in the public sphere at the moment?
I think my favorite technology that's being developed in Japan is it's a very unique, different approach to the human machine interaction
Mm-hmm.
than we see in the West.
Yeah.
And actually, a couple of years ago, some founder friends and I started the Evocative Machines project, and
Mm-hmm.
all of us got busy with our companies, and we haven't moved it forward. But it was the idea that we need to rethink about how we interact with machines, and not just like the UI, but the basic metaphor.
Yeah.
And I think that the Japanese approach to that is radically different and radically superior to what we see going on in the West. That's my sort of, I don't know, TED Talk, moonshot type answer. My more pragmatic answer is I think Japan is doing some amazing things in robotics and healthcare, particularly towards like elder care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And could you expand a bit just about like the Japanese side of robotics, just for those in the audience who might not know it too well?
Yeah, it's a deceptively deep subject, but I think at the core of the matter, Western cultures have a very adversarial view of automation and robotics in general.
Mm-hmm.
Most Westerners view automation and robots as competitors,
Mm-hmm.
and Japan doesn't see it that way.
Yeah.
And so the metaphor is seeing robots not as people, not as competitors, but more of like pets.
Mm-hmm.
Allowing our emotions to be influenced by robots
Mm-hmm.
in a good way.
Yeah.
Right? It's the Western metaphor is very stress inducing,
Mm-hmm.
and the Japanese approach is very calming.
Mm-hmm. Alrighty. Well, thank you for being here. Do you have anything you want to shout out to the audience? Anything you want to plug?
Well, definitely want to plug the show. So please check out Disrupting Japan, disruptingjapan.com.
Mm-hmm.
And thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed our conversation.
All right. Well, thank you.